Hello and good evening, everyone. My name is Oliver Tostman. I'm the Susan Morse Hillis Curator here at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art. And I could not be more excited to introduce Elizabeth Cropper as the speaker of tonight's lecture. We invited Dean Cropper in conjunction with our exhibition, By Her Hand, Artemisia Gentileschi and Women Artists in Italy from 1500 to 1800. And I hope that you all made it upstairs to see the show. If not, you have until January 9th. This lecture was made possible thanks to the James and Isabel English Endowment at Trinity College. Many thanks for the generous support. Dean Cropper is a renowned scholar of the Italian and French Renaissance and Baroque. And until 2020, she was the Dean of the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, the short form is CASWA, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. for 20 years. As Dean, she published 22 volumes in the eminent series Studies in the History of Art, and perhaps most importantly, she brought scholars from all over the world to D.C. Thanks to her efforts, scholars found at the center a unique space to think and to write, to converse freely, and to forge new friendships. Dean Cropper was born in England and holds a BA and MA from Cambridge University. She came to the United States to pursue a PhD from Bryn Mawr College. Eventually, she became professor of art history at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. During her time in Baltimore, she held visiting appointments at Cambridge University, the École de France, and the École des Fortitude in Paris. She has been a member of numerous scientific societies as well as academies and received prestigious prizes in the field. As a scholar, Cropper published important books on the Baroque artists Pietro Testa, Domenichino, and Nicolas Poussin. Another of her interests has been Artemisia Gentileschi. She published illuminating articles and essays about the artist in journals, and most recently in the exhibition catalogue of the Artemisia show at the National Gallery in London. In addition, she played a role at the Wadsworth's acquisition of Artemisia's self-portrait as a lute player in 2014. On a more personal note, I would like to mention that I met Elizabeth the first time after my arrival at the National Gallery in 2007. I was not a member of CASWA, but a fellow in the curatorial department. After Elizabeth learned that my supervisor, the late curator Philip Conisby, had just passed away, she quickly reached out to me and invited me to a lunch. This kind gesture, her interest and sympathy, helped me tremendously during that difficult time. So thank you, Elizabeth, and please join me in welcoming Elizabeth Cropper.
Thank you so very much, Oliver. And it's really such a pleasure to be speaking to you here tonight and to reflect upon the exhibition so creatively put together by Oliver Tostman and Eve Straussman-Flanzer. I was honored but also rather daunted by the invitation when it came in July, amidst pandemic restrictions and many uncertainties. Yet I could not resist, for I've had a long-standing invitation to the Atheneum that I could never find a way to take up. In fact, as Oliver just mentioned, just 7 years ago, in February 2014, Oliver, then the new curator for European painting, sculpture, and drawings here, asked me about a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, the so-called self-portrait as a lute player, that had just failed to sell at Christie's. As he pointed out, it's a stunning image, and it had been in all the recent international exhibitions. I had to remind Oliver, who'd been my colleague at the National Gallery of Art, that I could not, in my capacity there, give any kind of official expertise, but I could agree that the painting was a stunner. I had no idea why it had failed to sell, and having seen it several times, knew of no concerns around the scholarly world. Privately, I must say, I regretted that the National Gallery had not tried to secure the picture, which, though expensive, now looks something like a steal. But Oliver had asked me to keep the matter confidential, and in any case, the painting's availability was well known. I told him that many other institutions would be kicking themselves if Hartford managed to acquire the work, and acquire it you did. Oliver wrote to me on March 5th, 2016, to say that the painting was hanging in the galleries next to works by Caravaggio and by her father, Orazio, where she belongs. He thanked me for my help and asked me to let him know when he could show me the Hartford Artemisia. This is the first opportunity I've had, and I still haven't seen her in this company, but I've seen her today in very important company, and I plan to come back. I take great pleasure in seeing how such an acquisition not only enriches the collection of masterpieces in America's oldest public art museum, but also stimulates new thinking around the collection among experts, students, and public alike. The exhibition we're here to celebrate is evidence of that, for it expands the museum's commitment to the inclusion of women artists more generally. Before looking at the broader questions raised by the exhibition, we should recognize the extraordinary way in which the importance of this rare work from Artemisia's early years, painted when she was in her early 20s, was rapidly multiplied through the discovery, if not the production, of a context for it. In 2018, the National Gallery in London acquired a closely related work, Artemisia's self-portrait as St. Catherine of Alexandria. Unlike the Hartford picture, which had failed to sell at auction, this was sold in Paris well above its estimate in December 2017, and was only then scooped up by the National Gallery in London for an even higher sum. That acquisition also inspired an exhibition, an ambitious monographic display of Artemisia's secure works. With these two portraits now on public view, yet a third work, long known but not always so well regarded, joined their company. The St. Catherine of Alexandria, now proudly displayed as a work by Artemisia in the Uffizi, and you can see it upstairs, but first recorded there in 1890 as by a follower. Now seen as perhaps the most elegant and polished of the three, the painting was retrieved from storage by Luciano Bellozzi and exhibited as by Artemisia only in 1966. St. Catherine was also included in an exhibit of Caravaggia's paintings in Palazzo Pitti in 1970, where I first saw it. Then described by Evelina Boria as the best of Artemisia, with her aggressive, unconventional look, a fighter, fiery and rumpled, equal to a Judith. The St. Catherine was also accepted by Ward Bissell, author of the authoritative catalogue of 1999. Sadly, in that catalogue, he also had to record the damage this painting suffered in the mafia bombing of the Uffizi in 1993. These three paintings, whose relationship and even existence were unknown until just a few years ago, immediately engage us more deeply with Artemisia's work, her practice of painting, and her personality as an artist. The discoveries had a multiplier effect. Technical analysis, some of which is presented upstairs, has established that a tracing process was involved in the production of all three images, and that Artemisia adjusted her design as she went along. The contemporary artist best known for working in this way is, of course, Caravaggio, who's been shown to use a template for the repetition and variation of compositions, such as his lute player, which exists in two versions, one in the Hermitage and the other in the Wildenstein family collection. As Keith Christensen, who's pioneered this study, has shown, Artemisia would deploy this same technique in the more complex production of her second version of Judith and Holofernes, transferring the broad outlines from her first version, now in Naples, and adjusting the image. also directly associable, with Caravaggio, are the invocation of a musical culture, as in the Hartford picture. And this is a comparison I think that is particularly telling, would reward further consideration, as well as the focus on a living model in contemporary dress, one only lightly associated with a religious figure, and one whose identity remains as a result specifically in the present. These features are also prominent in works by Orazio Gentileschi, Artemisia's father and teacher, whose St. Cecilia in Detroit and Woman Playing a Lute in the National Gallery in Washington carry Caravaggio's work in this genre further forward, even as his Wadsworth Judith and Her Maidservant with the head of Holofernes posits a Caravaggesque vision of a biblical story that both relates to and is to be distinguished from Artemisia's own staging of the scene. The comparison of Artemisia with her father, triangulated with their shared model of Caravaggio, reveals the individuality and specificity of Artemisia's work and her grasp of Caravaggio's revolution. This was something Orazio Gentileschi had to master in his maturity. Baptized in 1563, Artemisia's father was painting in a rather conventional Mannerist style before his encounter with Caravaggio in or around 1600, when Caravaggio's large works in the Contarelli Chapel were on view. The artists knew each other quite well, though they inevitably fell out. But it took Orazio a while to master this very different new manner of working. Artemisia, on the other hand, 20 years younger than Caravaggio, learned to paint in this way from her beginnings in Rome, whether from Orazio or from works by Caravaggio available to her, or more likely, I think, both. Though I must disagree with Keith Christensen's attribution of a considerable part of the Palmersfelden Susanna and the Elders by Artemisia to Orazio, I do support his perception that in these early works, this is dated at 1610, we see Artemisia reaching, quote from Christensen, back beyond the example of Orazio to the very processes of Caravaggio's work, his initial use of the mirror to insert himself into pictures, and his self-identification with the act of representation. Here, Christensen cites the art historian Michael Fried, who writes, Caravaggio is one of those rare painters, and in this he's comparing him, in fact, to Courbet, whose paintings must be understood as evoking a primary, even primordial relationship to the painter himself. In my own previous study of Artemisia, I put this quite simply, quote myself, the new direction in the Gentileschi studio around 1610 involved the bodily presence of Artemisia as both model and painter. This was, I want you to recall, an entirely new situation for a woman artist. In focusing upon this quite straightforward point, I want to think about what makes Artemisia Gentileschi stand apart from other women artists included in this wonderful exhibition. Even those, namely Sophonisba Anguissola and Lavinia Fontana, who achieved a professional status many men would envy, as Sheila Barker discusses in the catalogue. My singling out of Artemisia is not necessarily a value judgment, but rather an observation based on certain historical facts. Other women might be singled out for different reasons, and of course these women did share some personal features. But so many of them, from Lavinia Fontana to Diana Scultori, Fede Galizia, to Suor Ursula Maddalena Caccia, Anna Maria Vaiani, and of course Elisabetta Sirani and Mariana Calevaris, all these works in the exhibition for your delight. That they were all the daughters of artists or trained in their families is fundamental, though Babette Bone has recently shown that in Bologna, where many women artists thrived, it was not absolutely a given. Others married artists or architects, and several like Artemisia herself, combined artistic production with having children. Lavinia Fontana was legendarily, almost perennially pregnant, producing 11. And Isabella Catanea Parasole, whose work you see here, and Ginevra Cantafoli each had 2. These facts and others considered in the catalogue, and it's rich in information, I urge you to read it, serve to fill in the contours of a complex world in which many women artists, never especially welcome, even as prodigies, nonetheless fulfilled their conventional domestic duties. Others, we should recall, entered convents. Education could also be a key to a woman's career, whether as a social asset, as it clearly was for Ursula Maddalena Caccia, whose father created a convent from which she could work. Giovanna Garzoni's education gave her access to courts throughout Italy, but was especially instrumental in bringing her exquisite natural history studies to the attention of the Accademia dei Lincei in Rome, which was particularly interested in natural history. Before he sent his daughter Sophonisba and her sister to learn painting with Bernardino Campi, their father Amilcare gave them a foundation in letters and in music. As much a necessary support for her painting as a technical skill, this sustained her career in her 90 years of life, providing her with the ability to consort with queens and maneuver her own marital affairs and independent travels across Europe. Although the business of Lavinia Fontana's career and income were officially managed by her father and her husband, her education made of her a learned virtuosa, capable of dealing diplomatically with the educated clergy and aristocratic elite of Bologna, as Caroline Murphy and others have shown. Lavinia would receive a degree from Bologna's Venerable University in 1580. From a familial and educational point of view, Artemisia stands apart. I'm sorry, a few of these images come via COVID on the internet because of the impossibility of getting them any other way. So forgive this rather fuzzy image of a beautiful drawing in the Morgan Library of her parents. Socially, Artemisia was imperiled from the moment of her mother Prudencia's death in 1650, when she herself was approaching 13, leaving her as the oldest of 4 children. An aunt appeared in the household briefly, but the woman in charge of Artemisia at the time of her rape in 1611 abandoned her at the scene of the crime. Furthermore, Artemisia's father, seen here in Van Dyck's drawing, was himself a social handicap with a reputation for irascible behavior that made him unwelcome at the Medici court. She was fortunate in having a more acceptable Tuscan uncle, but unlucky, I think, in the husband, Pier Antonio Stiatesi, foisted upon her. Her self-education in letters and comportment at the Medici court in Florence, where she painted the Hartford work, was definitely a question of remedial catch-up. Artemisia's passionate love affair with Francesco Maringhi, a wealthy and influential man, combined elements of material and social need with powerful physical and emotional longing, which comes through in the newly published letters. Maringhi could support her in ways nobody else could, and we're still learning the extent of this from Francesco Salinas, who has more letters now in print. Even as Maringhi gave the Stiatesi family financial help, at one point even taking care of the children and the furniture, the scandal of the relationship threatened to compromise Artemisia's standing at court, where the dominant female culture demanded at least the appearance of virtue. Such reckless behavior was not something we would expect of the highly professional Lavinia Fontana or the sophisticated Sophonisba Anguissola, even if Sophonisba would marry for love against the wishes of Grand Duke Francesco de' Medici in 1579. But by then, we should recall, she was a 44-year-old widow who could perhaps marry whomever she liked. Yet before going too far in setting Artemisia apart on account of her schemes and adventures, we should recognize that she was also capable of gaining support from powerful and influential figures who collected her work and appreciated her person. In Florence, the astronomer Galileo was one. In Rome, on her return there from Florence, Cassiano dal Pozzo, secretary to Cardinal Francesco Barberini, knew how to be a reliable patron. Though best known today for his relationship with Nicolas Poussin and his collection of drawings after ancient and natural history, Cassiano was notable in the 1620s for helping young artists, often from out of town. One, the Florentine Anna Maria Vaiani, who is included in the exhibition, was employed by both Cassiano and Vincenzo Giustiniani, Caravaggio's patron and collector. And through Cassiano, she became close to the Accademia di San Luca, the Artists' Academy, and the Accademia dei Lincei, where her drawings of flowers were deeply appreciated and adopted. The portrait of Artemisia that Cassiano commissioned from Simone Vouet, now to be seen in Pisa, epitomizes Cassiano's universal interests. It identifies Artemisia as her ancient namesake by showing her wearing a gold chain threaded through a gilded metal depicting the mausoleum the ancient queen built for her husband at Halicarnassus, a wonder of the ancient world. This is a very different image of Artemisia from those of her youth, perhaps inspired by the more somber image of her namesake on the reverse of Giovanni Cavino's bronze medal, but certainly closer to the mature figure of Judith, say in the second version of Judith and Holofernes, or other powerful heroines painted by Simone Vouet. This is a uniquely important portrait, painted by the Principe, the prince of the Accademia di San Luca, Vouet, for an influential patron, Cassiano, who would provide support to Artemisia over many years, as he also did for Giovanna Garzoni. The Cavino medal, which you see on the right, only recently identified, is not the only one to be identified associated with Artemisia. The exhibition includes a uniface, which is medalist speak for one-sided medal, commemorating Artemisia Gentileschi herself. You can see it upstairs. Inscribed, Artemisia Gentilesca Pictrix Calibris, or Artemisia Gentileschi, famous woman painter. This medal is almost unique, probably existing in only 2 examples, and it's wonderful that the Scher collection is now permanently housed at the Frick. And its value is heightened further by traces of gilding. You can see it on the pearls upstairs that she's wearing. That Artemisia was commemorated by a medal places her in an exclusive group among the artists in the exhibition, indeed among painters in general. First comes Sophonismus Medal, also uniface, of which the expert G.F. Hill records only 2 examples. This was likely made for entirely personal reasons, to record the painter's appearance before her departure for the Spanish royal court in November 1559. Her father would never see her again, and the inscription describes her simply as Sophonisba Anguistula, Amilcaris Filia, the daughter of Amilcare, with no reference to her work as a painter. The reverse, which you see on the right, shows the medal fused into a lead surround with a loop. Like the medal worn by Artemisia in the Vouet portrait, the object was to be on view, even worn, rather than kept out of sight and handled only occasionally. The temptation is great to see this, as Christine Walken has done, as a keepsake for Sophonisba's father. Made of lead, it was more permanent and portable than any painting, however miniature, including the beautiful miniature in the exhibition. Its comforting presence served as a constant reminder of their relationship, father and daughter, in her absence. And I think it's tempting to think that the second one that we know of was for Sophonisba herself. Next to be honored in this way was Diana Scultori, sorry about these images, whose double-sided medal is paired with that of her husband, the architect Francesco da Volterra. Conventional and rather clumsy, each of the medals, inscribed by the maker TR, shows a portrait on the obverse and an allegorical image on the reverse. Diana's displays the engraver's burin, actually engraving a plate with an image of the Virgin. The other, the square and compass of the architect Francesco. The left and right hands, and they are left and right hands here, complement one another. And the Latin tags are in the plural. Are incidimus, we engrave in copper, and si quid valemus, if we are worth anything or if we can do anything, emphasizing the connection between the two in this, I think, unprecedented representation of married artists. In fact, it's been suggested that the medals celebrate the couple's marriage around 1575, but the more convincing occasion, I believe, is a professional one. In 1577, both were admitted into the company of the Roman virtuosi of the Pantheon, which carried considerable status. After all, anybody could get married without receiving a medal for it. Most likely, the medals were made as a gesture of mutual self-recognition by an ambitious couple who also had Raffaellino da Reggio paint frescoes of stories of Hercules on the facade of their house. Excuse me. Lavinia Fontana's medal, included in the exhibition, third in the group, is of a much finer quality and exceptionally rare. It was made in Rome in 1611, it's dated, not long before Lavinia's death in 1614, and some 7 years after her arrival in the city. It's a highly sophisticated work showing Lavinia Fontana, Zappia, after her husband's name, Pictrix, as a demure matron in profile on the obverse, and identifying the medalist as Felice Antonio Cazzoni, together with the date. On the reverse, of which there's an image on the wall in the exhibition, we see a young woman seated at an easel, her improbably long hair flying wild as she looks upward, beginning to draw her idea on the canvas. It's important that she's not actually painting, for her palette and brushes are on the ground, and her mahlstock is idle in her hand. You see paint here and the brushes, the mahlstock. Her mouth is bound. In the border, a square and compass fill the space between the words of the inscription, Per te stato gioioso mi mantene. It's long been recognized that the image conforms in part to the personification of painting described in Cesare Ripa's Iconographia, first published in 1603, and that the inscription comes from Petrarch. But there's more to know, and the medal raises more questions than we can presently answer. First, identifying Lavinia with painting itself through an original figurative emblem showing that her wild and tousled hair reflects the inner fantasia's indifference to the outside world, together with the closed mouth as a bandage around her mouth of solitude, all following Ripa's description, places the medal in an academic setting. The inscription in the vernacular is rare for a medal, and I think perhaps suited by being in the vernacular to honor a woman painter. And it derives from a political poem not originally included in the canzoniere. The canzone, Quel che nostra natura in sé più degno, is celebrated for its statement that sweet liberty is little understood until it is lost. To paraphrase Petrarch, it is liberty that makes life flourishing and verdant, and through liberty that the poet remains joyful, as in the inscription. For it makes me, the poet, seem like the other gods. Without it, he goes on, Petrarch had no wishes for riches, honor, and the things men both desire. The inscription surely does not mean, as is often implied, that through painting the figure is in a constant state of joy, sustained by some sort of creative fury. It's a very romantic interpretation. But rather, as Angela Girardi has suggested, it's about the intellectual freedom that makes life worth living. The square and the compass provide further signifiers of this liberty. not the attributes of the painter, but the attributes of the theories of design and the intellect on which it's based. Lavinia had cultivated this vision of herself as a liberal artist in Bologna, where the world of the university and the church sustained it. The position that painting was a liberal and intellectual profession was also being fostered in Rome through the Accademia di San Luca, of which Lavinia's husband, Giampaolo Zappi, became a member in 1608. But Rome was not Bologna, and according to my colleague Peter Luckhart, Lavinia's membership in the Academy was likely among the honorary inclusions. Felice Antonio Casoni, however, who made fewer than 10 medals, including this one, well understood Lavinia's self-image. Born in Ancona in 1559, Casoni was educated in Bologna, where he made 2 medals in honor of Dionisio Ratta in 1592, celebrating his building of the church of San Pietro Martire. You see one here. And another in honor of Cardinal Alfonso Paliotti's rebuilding of the cathedral in Bologna in 1605. Both Ratti and Paliotti commissioned works from Lavinia Fontana. Casoni's first known medal, also made in Bologna around 1590, was dedicated to the musician, composer, and architect Ercole Bottrigari. This is much closer in spirit to Lavinia's medal, for it shows Bottrigari in profile on the obverse, with a stringed instrument, an astrolabe, a square, a compass, and a counting tablet on the reverse, standing for the mathematical arts of measurement and harmony, which the inscription says can never be pursued enough. And you can see here the counting tablet, the astrolabe, the square, the compass, stringed instrument on this object, which is probably about this big. Both medals emphasize theory rather than practice. Bottrigari at the top, and down below we have Lavinia. The Ratta medals and a handful of medals Casoni made in Rome, including the 1604 example, a very rare medal again to find illustrated, commemorating the Palazzo Nuovo on the Campidoglio, all reflect the patronage of Pope Clement VIII and his nephew, Cardinal Pietro Aldobrandini. With the death of Clement in 1605, the cardinal would retire with his court to Ancona. Now, Lavinia had also been supported in Rome, brought to Rome by the Aldobrandini, but she remained there with the support of Paul V Borghese, his successor. Among Cardinal Aldobrandini's closest Bolognese familiars, who also remained in Rome, was Giovan Battista Agucchi, seen in this wonderful portrait on the left, friend and patron of many Bolognese artists. Agucchi was particularly fond of allegorical imprese or devices, inventing several himself. While the imagery of Lavinia's medal is not complex, especially with a copy of Reaper to hand, it's expressed in such an original way that it had to be conceived by someone in sympathy with the sitter and the allegorical language that defined her. This could have been Casoni, but I think only in the context of the circle of Agucchi and the Aldobrandini, and of course, the Accademia di San Luca. The brilliance of the design, its pictorial quality and naturalistic details, even including the image of the painter's foot here resting on the easel, suggests perhaps an intervention by Lavinia herself. The significance of the date 1611 remains to be defined. I'll have some ideas about this, but not certain. But the significance of Lavinia's liberal aspirations beyond the tools of the trade is undeniable. Now, 1611 was quite fortuitously a very significant year in the life of Artemisia Gentileschi. For in early May that year, she was raped by the painter Agostino Tassi in her father's house. Francesco Salinas, seeing beyond stylistic differences, has proposed that Lavinia provided an artistic and social model for Artemisia, even as Lavinia was certainly aware of Sophonismus, and that Artemisia's wish to escape from scandals in Rome to Bologna at one point was prompted by her knowledge that Lavinia had prospered there. Artemisia's single-sided medal goes even beyond Lavinia's, abandoning allegory, and presents the painter in her own person. This sort of profile obverse of a woman who is neither a consort nor a ruler is traditionally a celebration of the ideal beauty of a noblewoman, a model already adopted for the medal of the Bolognese poet Lucia del Oro. And this is just a very typical example of a model of a beauty, not made because she's powerful or a spouse, but in honor of her beauty. And here is the adaptation of that kind of thing for a poet in Bologna. Artemisia is presented as a living person with a professional identity. Now, much has been made of her loosened hair, connecting it to Ripa's image, but I think this is rather an example of art imitating life. For in Simone Vouet's circle, Vouet, as you remember, having painted Artemisia, such loosened hair was popular and favored by Artemisia herself for her heroines. It's surely just as important that, like other beauties, she wears her pearls and she wears her pearls and her earrings. The connection often made to a print by Jérôme David is, of course, stronger. Here, Artemisia is described as Artemisia Gentileschi Romana, famosissima pittrice, academica nei Desiosi. Whether or not this reference to the Academy in Venice, the Academy of the Desiosi in Venice, as usually assumed, or, I suggest, to the academy founded by Maurizio of Savoy in Rome in 1623, the image itself is based on a self-portrait, as the inscription indicates, the inscription on the print. Once again, I think the likelihood is that Artemisia was involved in designing her own medal, after which it was modeled and cast. Given the probable date of the medal in the mid-1620s, although many of the dates throughout this lecture are quite conjectural, its high quality and its rarity, I'm tempted to propose that it was produced at the wishes of Cassiano del Pozzo, collector of medals and all things ancient, who had Vouet paint for him the living Artemisia wearing a modern medal of an ancient wonder. Like Lavinia's medal, it surely belongs in the wider context of the Accademia di San Luca in Rome. Now, I think we can learn a good deal about women's agency from this extraordinary group of medals, whether motivated and going from left to right by familial piety, perhaps social ambition, patronal culture, or to capture a modern identity in an ancient medium. Their context and their rarity, however, require us to rethink ideas that these medals served as vehicles for self-promotion, as often said. They provided prized records of existence, signs of prestige closely held, but they did not and could not make these women famous. They could not compensate for exclusion from academies or the absence, with few exceptions, of published biographies that put the fame of men into circulation over the centuries, nor could they influence the formation of collections in modern museums, shaped by those literary accounts and the academic disciplines that relied upon them. Now, I want to turn away at this point from the fascinating lives of these women and recognize the relative lack of fame and reputation accorded them over later centuries, turning away from early modern Europe, when every one of them somehow found a place to thrive, whether in a court, a convent, a collector's cabinet, or even in the marketplace, to our own time and place. The exhibition acknowledges the specific question of why these women have not been recognized in museums before. In her introductory essay to the catalogue, Eve Strausman-Flanzer explains how collecting practices and art history, connoisseurship, and biography, combined with deep-rooted misogyny and modern gender bias, to exclude women from view. No matter how successful they were in their own times, at managing the networks of patronage that subtended their practice, the posthumous lives of early modern women artists were generally short, lasting at most through the 18th century. Griselda Pollock and Rosika Parker have argued that the causes for this lie in the consolidation of bourgeois society in the 19th century, leading to the near obliteration of women artists in the 20th century. And it is indeed striking that in his famous article, foundational article of 1916 on Gentileschi padre e figlia, Gentileschi father and daughter, the preeminent Italian art historian Roberto Longhi felt compelled to take a swipe at the faded peinture de femme, women's painting, of Sophonisba, Lavinia, Fede Galizia, Caterina Ginazzi, and Giovanna Garzoni, his list, as he compared Artemisia favorably to Judith Leister. Mostly wrong, however, about Artemisia's oeuvre, and calling her strange, obstinate, and proud, he conceded her importance in Naples as the midwife of a new school, but otherwise placed, as he called her, Signorina Artemisia, in her father's footsteps, imagining, and I quote, Signora Schiattesi, giving her her married name, being worried that Holofernes' blood might stain her new yellow silk dress. It's beyond irony that it was Longhi's wife, Lucia Lopresti, writing under the pseudonym of Anna Banti, who would write the first modern account of Artemisia in 1947, revealing through the devices of fiction the problematic of feminist history and biography. The first feminist consideration of Artemisia, written by a woman who had her own feminist battles to fight, and Longhi's quotation certainly makes that obvious, I think. Banti's book made little immediate impact upon art history in Italy. A commitment to a feminist art history without which the history of women artists would never be written came instead from English-speaking academic communities from Australia to the UK and the United States, where the first women's studies program was established at San Diego State University in 1970. Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, you will all recall, had appeared in 1963, marking a decade of feminist action and writing. Now, in the vast and deep history of the women's movement globally, I can only spotlight in this context one landmark moment for the history of art in the United States. Just 50 years ago, Linda Nochlin published her essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Hence, I hope you can all understand the witty title of Eve Straussman-Flantz's contribution to the exhibition catalogue. Quote, why have there been no exhibitions of early modern women artists in Hartford or Detroit? And that is the question. In Nochlin's essay, the title of which she attributed to a question from the rather unfriendly, in this context, dealer Richard Feigen, she examined what she called, quote, the total situation of art making. After challenging the myth of the great artist and the entrenched allure of notions of unique genius and romantic talent, she set out to lay bare the social, institutional, and economic structures under which art was made, and which made it impossible for women artists to succeed. Both parts of her argument were important, and in her subsequent work, Nochlin was as dedicated to undermining the naturalized positions of the white Western male as to promoting the work of women. To do only the latter, promote the work of women, she wrote, quote, is to swallow the bait, hook, line, and sinker, and try to answer the question as it's put. That is, in her words, to dig up examples of worthy or insufficiently appreciated women artists throughout history, end quote. To, quote, rediscover forgotten flower painters. And she did not spare, in her criticism, recent studies on Angelica Kaufman and Artemisia Gentileschi. Such efforts, in Nochlin's view, added to our knowledge of art history and women's achievement generally, but did nothing to question the assumptions behind Feigen's remark. Equally unproductive were studies proposing a special character for women's art, in Naucklin's view. And here, I just want to commend Oliver Tossman's catalogue essay on the advantages of painting small for taking a fresh look at one practice that had long been associated with women, but to their detriment. Nauchlin knew her proposal for a different kind of art history would not be accomplished quickly. And despite her reservations about digging up forgotten artists, she agreed to co-curate the foundational exhibition Women Artists 1550 to 1950, organized by the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 1976. Its history is telling. Feminist groups in Los Angeles had noted that, for example, LACMA's 1971 Art and Technology exhibition included no women at all, and only one person of color. Artists in the Feminist Studio Workshop in Los Angeles, including Judy Chicago, Arlene Raven, and Sheila de Bretteville, demanded more representation. These West Coast complaints were linked to protests in New York in 1968 against the exclusion of Black artists from the Whitney exhibition, the 1930s, Painting and Sculpture in America, and to the founding of the Black Emergency Coalition for Culture, which also picketed the Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Met early in 1969. According to Anne Sutherland Harris, first president of the Women's Caucus for Art, which was founded in 1972, and who recruited Nauchlin to work with her on the exhibition in LA, the women's group initially proposed an exhibition at LACMA devoted to Artemisia, but her own counter-proposal to represent a larger group of women artists from Europe and North America prevailed. Several of the women included in the Hartford Detroit exhibition were included in the LACMA show. Artemisia herself would have to wait another 30 years for a monographic exhibition in New York, and then share this with her father. Both Harris and Nauchlin contributed essays to the 1976 catalogue. In discussing works from 1800 to 1950, Nauchlin went into questions of, quote, feminist imagery, quote, feminist presence in the decorative arts, and the role of economic and institutional factors. Writing about period 1550 to 1800, closest to that represented here, Harris focused more on what Germaine Greer would later call the obstacle race, the difficulties confronting women artists in the fulfillment of their potential. Harris's concluding questions, including, quote, to what degree has prejudice resulted in the neglect and inadequate appreciation of their work? Is the relative silence of modern art historical scholarship a just reflection on their merits? Do any of these women deserve a place in the standard survey courses that introduce students to the peaks of achievement in Western art? Her questions tended more towards what Nauchlin had called taking the bait, about why there are no great women artists, or whether there ever were, and the principle of integration into the canons of art history they imply would persist as one very strong current in feminist art history, anxious to see Artemisia in Jansen, to put it in shorthand. These questions may no longer be asked in the context of survey courses, which have been transformed dramatically since those days, but they're still heard occasionally among those responsible for acquiring and displaying works of art. Though rejected by Nauchlin, many of these questions asked by Harris and others in the 1970s were courageous in an often hostile climate for women's rights in general. Subsequent feminist writings could be harsh on their rejection of what they called additive feminism, that tended to see the history of women only as a fight against exclusion. In 1976, Lucy Lippard pointed to the danger of women accepting a piece of the pie, even as she pointed to the dangers of marginality. Pollock and Parker, Griselda Pollock and Rosika Parker, writing in 1981, were scornful of what they saw as feminists, quote, rummaging in dusty basements to find old mistresses, end quote, and proposed that surmounting obstacles was meaningless without a parallel history of the rules of the game, stacked against the women. Instead of proposing monographic rehabilitation, their starting point was that women artists had always existed, but had been obliterated from the record. Recovery of the history of women would not come, as they put it, from the relocation of women in art history on the discipline's own terms, but only in the context of, quote, a concomitant deconstruction of the practices of art history itself. In this climate, strangely enough, Artemisia Gentileschi's place in history was often vulnerable. Germaine Greer wrote this very popular book published in 1979, identified Artemisia as, quote, the magnificent exception, who represented for women the female equivalent of an old master, the exception to all the rules. She recognized the price Artemisia paid for this, however, urging that only meticulous investigation of all her work would be worthy of her. Mary Garrard and Ward Bissell lived up to that challenge, but I think Artemisia continues to pay the price for her old master status, joining the club, as it were, by being forever compared to her father, whether negatively or positively. Meanwhile, for other feminists, the very notion of Artemisia's exceptionality was a regrettable diversion, as was the dramatic story of her life. While the status of the magnificent exception was being thrashed out in academic art history, still continues in some quarters, Artemisia immediately provided inspiration for feminist artists. For Judy Chicago, who was a founder of the Feminist Studio Workshop and the feminist art programs at CalArts, had been involved in the original protests against LACMA, it was Artemisia who deserved a place at the table in her epic multimedia work, The Dinner Party, constructed between 1974 and 1979. See Artemisia embroidered here. Here is the Artemisia plate, and here is the full installation in Brooklyn. And when a group of women, inspired by the first annual Midwest Conference on Women Artists, at which Anne Sutherland Harris lectured, banded together in Chicago to form a women's art collective in 1973, they called it Artemisia. Workshops, lectures, and exhibitions featuring distinguished women pointed up, among many other things, the lack of women on the graduate faculty at the Art Institute of Chicago. Meanwhile, in New York, Mae Stevens would choose Artemisia as a subject for her contribution to the sister chapel, every pun intended, conceived by Elise Greenstein in 1974 as a challenge to the, quote, androcentric view of art history. And here we see this very interesting painting now in the collection of the National Museum for Women in the Arts, in which painting of Artemisia is the background of this group of colleagues in Soho. Among the 12 subjects in this ambitious project to create a kind of feminist Sistine Chapel were Bella Abzug by Alice Neal and Betty Friedan by June Bloom. In choosing Artemisia, Stevens acknowledged the influence of Linda Nochlin, noting that it was Mary Garrard and Judith Brodsky who'd called her attention to the documents for Artemisia's baptism and the rape trial that she inscribed with great care behind the subject, whose right hand, of course, she modeled on Dumontier's 1625 drawing, something that's always associated with Artemisia. Stevens, in painting this, was active in civil rights and feminist circles in New York. She was an original member of the Guerrilla Girls, a founding member of Heresies magazine. And together with Emma Amos, another Guerrilla Girl, currently having an exhibition in Philadelphia, Camille Billups and Vivian Brown. Together with these colleagues, Stevens worked for civil rights, women's rights, and the advancement of women artists, including those of color. The exhibition dedicated to these, quote, friends and agitators, presented at the Ryan Lee Gallery this summer, provided an inspiring reminder of the intersectional struggles of women artists some 50 years ago. Whatever the conclusions of art history and the guardians of the canon, for these women and the communities they built from the 1970s on, Artemisia Gentileschi had a powerful afterlife as an icon of a woman artist's triumph. And it's important to recognize that, like concerned scholars such as Griselda Pollock, they were also intensely aware that the exclusion of women was intricately bound up with the historical exclusion of other groups, especially people of color. This is quite remarkable, given that in the 1970s in the United States, knowledge of Artemisia largely depended on interpretation of Ward Bissell's short article in the 1968 Art Bulletin, in which the artist's work, reproduced in black and white, was presented in English for the first time with documentation. It says something about the power of Artemisia's name and her work and her story. In this context, the acquisition of Artemisia's great Judith and Her Maidservant by the Detroit Institute of Arts in 1952 was extraordinary, as was Eleanor Dorrance Ingersoll's gift of Esther and Ahasuerus to the Met in 1969. The strength of feeling about Artemisia Gentileschi as a figure who speaks to the present continues to this day. And I saw only recently the work by Sutapa Biswas, who picks up the work of Artemisia in a new way. Now, I may have seemed to stray from my topic, but I am in fact arriving at my conclusion. My title, as you may have noticed, comes in two parts. The second is the easier to explain. Artemisia's adventures may summon up colorful episodes in her life. It often does. Her affair with Meringue, falling off her horse as she crossed a river escaping from Florence, or her journey to London. These are good stories, and they have the advantage of being true. But the name Artemisia also constitutes a body of work that represents her true fame and continues to do so in surprising ways. From the moment Benedetto Luti sent Artemisia's Susanna and the Elders to Count Lothar Franz von Schönborn in 1714 as a work by Orazio, signature almost certainly by them painted out, he did this almost certainly to satisfy his patron's taste for nudes, while at the same time avoiding scandal, given that, as Rodolfo Matthias has put it, it was not good to give a Caravagesque proto-feminist work to a misogynist German archbishop. From that moment to the recent purchases in Hartford and London of just such a Caravagesque proto-feminist work, every movement of Artemisia's paintings is an adventure. Nevertheless, she persisted. 3 words uttered in February 2017 by a powerful senator who had silenced a powerful woman, also a senator, after warning her not to continue reading aloud the words of a civil rights leader critical of a man being considered for high office. The phrase instantly became a feminist motto, a reminder of obstacles that remain even where women appear to have gained equality. Its context restates the links between civil rights and women's rights in our time. The arguments for these rights made by feminists and civil rights activists, including artists and art historians, in the early 1970s, are, I think, as urgent as ever. Now, the current exhibition might indeed be viewed as a reformulation of the exhibition of 1976, which its organizers hoped would make such an anthological display of art by women no longer necessary. Yet the Hartford-Detroit exhibition asks a different question. What does hanging these works on the walls of 2 venerable institutions tell us about those institutions and what might come of this. Without doubt, the exhibition disturbs the comfortable parameters of tradition and frames or helps to frame the museums themselves in a historical light. Women artists have been excluded, not because they were not great or even good enough, but because the reputations they often enjoyed in their own time were systematically ignored, disrespected, or rendered invisible. Now, asking why women have been excluded is just one step from the question of who else has been excluded and why. There are no simple answers, but this is a good place to begin. Most regrettably, I think, it's generally, in fact almost always, if always, been overlooked that the 1976 LACMA Women's Art Exhibition immediately followed upon another notable anthological presentation within a month. 2 centuries of Black American art, for which the late David Driscoll served as the curator, closed in November 1976. Charles White produced a lithograph to raise funds for the exhibition and to use for the poster. My last point, the exhibition will disappear in a few months, leaving the Athenaeum's historic collection undisturbed, except for the fact that the acquisition of a self-portrait by the 20-year-old Artemisia Gentileschi has established a permanent question mark that will challenge everyone who comes here. Thank you very much.